What if the most dangerous man in World War II wasn't fighting the enemy, but fighting his own side? What if the general who moved faster than any army in history was also moving faster than anyone could control, and the men above him knew it, feared it, and had no idea what to do about it? In the summer of 1944, somewhere between the smoking ruins of Normandy and the gates of Germany itself, three of the most powerful military minds of the 20th century found themselves locked in a collision that had nothing to do with bullets or tanks. It had everything to do with ego, genius, insubordination, and the terrifying question of what happens when a weapon becomes too powerful for the hand that holds it. This is the story of George S. Patton, Dwight D. Eisenhower, and Harry S. Truman, and the moment when one man's brilliance threatened to unravel everything the Allies had built. If this kind of deep, immersive history moves something in you, please subscribe to this channel right now. Hit that like button. Share this video with someone who loves real stories about real men facing impossible decisions. And drop a comment below telling us something about Patton you never knew before. Because by the end of the story, there will be plenty to choose from. George Smith Patton Jr. was not born to follow orders. He was born to give them, to execute them with ferocious speed, and occasionally to ignore them when they conflicted with the electric certainty he felt in his bones. By the time Operation Overlord was launched on June 6, 1944, Patton had already been relieved of command once, publicly humiliated, and nearly sent home forever. And yet here he was, still in the war, still dangerous, still indispensable. He had commanded the U.S. 7th Army in Sicily in the summer of 1943, had driven his men through hellish terrain in record time, and had arrived in Messina before the British under Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, a small tactical victory that carried enormous symbolic weight. Patton didn't just win battles. He won them in ways that made other generals look slow, timid, and conventional. That was the problem. Men who make others look small are rarely forgiven for it. The slapping incident of August 1943 nearly ended everything. At a field hospital in Sicily on August 3rd, Patton encountered Private Charles H. Cole, a soldier sitting among the wounded not from any physical injury, but from what would later be recognized as battle fatigue. Patton, who believed with iron conviction that psychological collapse on the battlefield was a form of cowardice, struck the man across the face with his gloves and ordered him back to the front. 1 week later, on August 10th, he did the same to another soldier, Private Paul G. Bennett. War correspondents who witnessed these incidents held the story for weeks, but when journalist Drew Pearson broadcast it on November 21, 1943, the American public erupted. Congressmen called for Patton's dismissal. Generals braced for fallout. And Dwight D. Eisenhower, the Supreme Commander who had developed a complex and delicate relationship with Patton over many years, was forced to make one of the most painful decisions of his career: punish him publicly, humiliate him further, and keep him away from command. But do not let him go. Because Eisenhower knew something the newspapers didn't. He knew that Patton, at his worst, was still better than almost anyone else at their best. Eisenhower's management of Patton was an act of continuous psychological negotiation. Born in Denison, Texas, on October 14, 1890, Eisenhower had grown through the military ranks with a different kind of intelligence than Patton. Not the thunderous battlefield instinct, but the cool, architectural mind of a supreme organizer, a coalition builder, a man who understood that winning the war required keeping the Allies together as much as it required defeating the Germans. He had known Patton for years, had admired him, had grown frustrated with him, and had defended him when it would have been politically easier to let him fall. After the slapping incidents, Eisenhower wrote Patton a letter that was simultaneously a reprimand and a lifeline. He told Patton that his actions were unworthy of a soldier, that they had done serious damage, and that he expected Patton to do better. But he did not relieve him. Instead, he used Patton in one of the most elaborate deceptions of the war, Operation Fortitude, the plan to convince Hitler that the main Allied invasion of Europe would come not at Normandy, but at Pas-de-Calais, led by none other than the American general the Germans feared most. Patton stood at the center of a ghost army, a fiction of tanks and soldiers built from inflatable equipment and radio traffic, while the real invasion was being planned elsewhere. He played his role, and the Germans believed it. But keeping Patton in a cage, even a comfortable one, was never going to last. On August 1, 1944, 56 days after D-Day, Patton was given command of the newly activated U.S. Third Army in France, and what happened next stunned military observers on both sides of the conflict. In a matter of weeks, Patton's forces swept across France with a speed that defied the conventional logic of warfare. By late August, the Third Army had advanced further and faster than almost any army in the history of modern warfare, liberating city after city, crossing rivers, overwhelming German defenses before they could be consolidated, and generating a momentum that seemed almost supernatural. In a single week in late August 1944, the Third Army advanced over 400 miles. German commanders on the Western Front began sending frantic messages back to Berlin. They couldn't predict where Patton would strike next because Patton himself sometimes didn't decide until the last moment, moving on instinct, on feel, on that electric current of battlefield awareness that no military academy could teach and no headquarters could replicate. And it was precisely here, in the breathtaking, dangerous, glorious momentum of August and September 1944, that Eisenhower began to notice what many around Patton had been noticing for years. Patton was not simply aggressive. He was operating, increasingly, by his own internal logic, a logic that sometimes aligned with official strategy and sometimes ran dangerously ahead of it or around it. When Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, known as SHAF, made decisions about supply allocation, about strategic priorities, about which army group would receive fuel and ammunition for the next push, Patton's reactions were not those of a subordinate accepting orders. They were those of a general who believed, with absolute and unshakable conviction, that he alone understood how to end the war, and that the men above him were squandering the opportunity. He argued, he lobbied, he complained, and when none of that worked, he sometimes simply kept moving and asked forgiveness later. The fuel crisis of September 1944 became the defining moment of this tension. As Allied forces outran their supply lines, SHAF had to make an agonizing choice: concentrate limited fuel resources on one main thrust into Germany, or maintain a broader advance across the entire front. Eisenhower chose a strategy that favored Field Marshal Montgomery's 21st Army Group in the north, a decision that effectively halted Patton's Third Army in its tracks near the Moselle River. To Patton, this was not a strategic decision. It was a catastrophic mistake, possibly driven by favoritism toward the British, possibly by Eisenhower's own excessive caution, possibly by a failure of nerve at the Supreme Command level. He said so loudly and repeatedly to anyone who would listen. On September 2, 1944, Patton's forces had roughly 400,000 gallons of fuel. By September 3rd, he had been told to halt. He wrote in his diary that the decision was stupid, and that with adequate fuel he could be in Germany in 10 days. He believed it completely. And the terrifying thing, the thing that kept Eisenhower awake at night, was that he might have been right. Now, at the exact midpoint of this story, it's worth pausing to ask you directly, are you still watching because this feels like more than just history? Because what you're seeing unfold between these men, the genius who can't be controlled, the leader who must hold everything together, the politician who watches from a distance, this is a story about power, about restraint, about what happens when individual brilliance collides with institutional necessity. If this narrative is moving you, if it's making you think, please subscribe to this channel right now. Give this video a like, share it with a friend who has never heard this story the way it deserves to be told, and leave a comment below telling us what moment in this story surprised you most. We read every single one. Harry S. Truman entered this constellation of personalities not as a general, but as a politician, and then, with shocking suddenness, as the most powerful man on earth. On April 12, 1945, Franklin Delano Roosevelt died at Warm Springs, Georgia, and Truman, the former senator from Missouri who had been vice president for only 82 days, was sworn in as the 33rd President of the United States. He had not been briefed on the Manhattan Project. He had not been included in the highest levels of strategic planning. He knew Patton by reputation, as did every American who had followed the war in the newspapers and in the newsreels. Patton with his ivory-handled pistols, his gleaming helmet, his theatrical fury, his undeniable results. But Truman knew something else about Patton, something that the American public was only beginning to learn in the final months of the war. He knew that Patton's logic, brilliant as it was on the battlefield, was becoming a political problem of the first order. The liberation of the Ohrdruf concentration camp on April 4, 1945, changed something in Patton. Eisenhower ordered all nearby American commanders to visit the camp so that no one could later deny what had happened there, so that there would be witnesses with rank and credibility. Patton went. What he saw made even this man, who had driven through burning tanks and walked through fields of the dead without flinching, physically ill. He later wrote that it was the most horrible thing he had ever seen, and for a brief and genuine moment, the armored exterior cracked. But this same Patton, this man capable of human horror and human feeling, was also the man who, in the weeks following Germany's surrender on May 8, 1945, began making statements about the Soviet Union that sent shockwaves through Allied command. He openly suggested, in conversations and eventually in public, that the Allies should consider rearming German prisoners to fight the Soviets, that the real enemy had not yet been defeated, that the war had merely entered a new and more dangerous phase. These were not whispers. These were the words of a four-star general, spoken with the authority of the man who had perhaps done more than anyone to defeat Nazi Germany, and they were becoming impossible to ignore. Truman, navigating the catastrophically delicate politics of the emerging Cold War, the Potsdam Conference of July and August 1945, and the relationship with Stalin that Roosevelt had cultivated and that he was now inheriting in ruins, could not afford a general who spoke like a freelance foreign policy hawk. When Patton gave an infamous press conference on September 22, 1945, in Bad Tölz, Bavaria, comparing the Nazi Party to the Democratic and Republican parties, remarks that exploded across the front pages of every major American newspaper. The end came swiftly. Eisenhower relieved Patton of command of the Third Army on October 2, 1945. Patton was given command of the 15th Army, a largely administrative posting. He was devastated, furious, and resigned to the fact that his war, his real war, was over. Truman, when informed of the situation, reportedly said that Patton was a fool who didn't know when to keep his mouth shut, but also acknowledged, with the grudging honesty that characterized his presidency, that the man could fight like no one else alive. On December 9, 1945, Patton was involved in a low-speed automobile collision near Mannheim, Germany. He suffered a broken neck. He was paralyzed from the shoulders down. And on December 21, 1945, George Smith Patton Jr. died quietly in his sleep at the age of 60 in a hospital in Heidelberg, Germany, a man who had spent his entire life in violent motion, ending in perfect stillness. What Truman said when Eisenhower began noticing that Patton was moving with his own logic was not a single memorable sentence, but a truth that resonated across every level of command in history. That some men are irreplaceable precisely because they are uncontrollable, and that the moment the war no longer needs them, the peace will not know what to do with them. Patton was the sword that could not be sheathed. Eisenhower was the hand that tried to hold it, and Truman was the president who watched the blade finally still. History remembers all three, but it is Patton who haunts us, because somewhere in his furious, flawed, magnificent refusal to move at anyone else's pace, there is a question we keep asking about genius, about power, about the men who changed the world and cannot survive the world they changed. If this story reached something in you, if you felt the weight of these decisions, the tragedy of these men, the impossible mathematics of war and command, then please subscribe to this channel so you never miss another story like this one. Like this video to help it reach the people who need to hear it. Share it with someone in your life who believes that history is the most dramatic story ever told. And leave a comment right now telling us.